Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this Latin American Plant Humanities workshop. My name is Liz Chant. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Warwick and a visiting fellow at the Centre for Latin American Studies and the Institute of Modern Languages Research, who are very kindly facilitating and hosting this online event. We're going to be hearing 3 presentations today from experts that are working and researching in this field. And just before I say a couple of words about that, a little bit of housekeeping as ever. Please, when you are in the meeting, keep your camera on if you're able to. That would be really lovely for our speakers, but also keep your microphone switched off. This meeting is being recorded. So if you ask a question after any of the presentations, you will be on the recording. If you would prefer to not be on the recording, you're obviously welcome to ask a question by writing it in the chat, and we will facilitate a response that way. And if you have any questions about anything that pop up kind of logistically, please feel free to send me a message through the Zoom chat. So the idea behind today's workshop is really to bring a focus to the important histories and cultures surrounding plants in Latin America. This is a field of very extensive research that exists especially already in the Americas, but that we're hoping to shine a spotlight today on some activity that's going on partly in the US in our final presentation, but also in the UK, to learn a bit more about what work is going on in this field and how it relates to some of the scholarship that's already out there. And also to give anyone who might be interested in this field, perhaps who might be working in environmental humanities already, but would like to do something with plants or learn more about how to integrate plants or vegetal collections into their research, some ideas about where to start, what to look for, perhaps even collections that might be of interest to you. So we're going to start off with a presentation from Lesley Wylie, who's based at the University of Leicester, and Lesley's going to be talking to us about her work, particularly on plants in Latin American literature. And the title of the presentation is Plants in the Archive, Tracing Vegetal Roots in Carpentier and Neruda. So we're running very on time, so that's good. So we'll make a start if that's okay, Lesley. So if you can go ahead and share your screen. Each of the sessions are blocked into about 40 minutes, so we'll have a bit of time at the end after each presentation for a couple of questions or discussion, and we really want this to be an interactive session, so please feel free to ask anything or pose any thoughts or ideas you might have after the presentations are finished. So Lesley, I will hand it over to you. Would you like me to give you any temporal indications, or are you happy to?
Well, I think I've got my stopwatch. So if I'm way over, you can just sort of, wave at me or something like that. But hopefully I'll keep to time. Okay. So I think you've given me about 40 minutes, and yes. In that time, I'd like to leave maybe 10 minutes or so just for questions and conversation at the end. Thanks very much, Liz. Thanks to everybody at the Centre for Latin American and Caribbean Studies as well for asking me to come and talk today. And thanks to the audience for coming along as well. I'm always a little bit nervous when someone describes me as an expert. So I'm going to start by sort of saying that what I propose to share with you today really isn't my expertise so much as my experiences of working with plants. Some of those experiences were, they were all useful. Some of it went very well, some of it went a bit less well, but, and I'm sure that many of you will also have had those kind of experiences. So hopefully I can learn a bit from you as well as you learning from me. And basically my presentation today relates to my recent book called The Poetics of Plants in Spanish American Literature. Now I'm not going to talk about my book really, or any of the, well, at least not much of the research from the book. What I want to talk about today is to think about how I conducted some of that research. But I will start by telling you a little bit about the book, and then I'll move on to give you a couple of examples of my archival work when I was conducting this research. So I first became interested in plants when I was working on the Novella De La Salva for my doctoral studies at Cambridge in the early 2000s. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Novella De La Salva, basically, this is the name given to a group of regional novels from the 20s and 30s set in the Amazon jungle, and often concerned with issues of local and national identity, indigenous culture, and landscape aesthetics. And really, that kind of sparked a excuse me for my cough, a longer career-long so far interest in plants. I continued working on the Amazon in my next project on the Putumayo region on the Peruvian Colombian border. And I just kept coming across this question of plant sentience, the issue of and representation, I suppose, of plants as being communicative, feeling beings, which was central to the Novella De La Salva, but also to other plant-focused literature. So around 2015, I began to explore this in other genres and periods, and this is the result of this was my book, which came out with Pittsburgh in 2020. So whilst much of my approach to the research for this book was quite conventional in terms of the sort of humanities research, so it involved, close readings of primary texts and secondary literature, two chapters in particular started to sort of seem like they needed a bit more archival work. And that was chapter 3 and chapter 5. So my chapters on Carpentier, the Cuban writer, Alejo Carpentier, and the final chapter on Pablo Neruda. And whilst working on these chapters, I found myself wanting to know what these authors had read about plants, how much they knew about the botanical terms and symbolism they were drawing upon in their works. And whilst this was important for other authors as well, it seemed to be particularly important in these two chapters. So luckily, my research had been supported by a Leverhulme Fellowship, and I kind of anticipated that these two chapters were going to involve that sort of research. So I had factored in 2 research trips into the budget for this fellowship. One trip was I proposed to go to Havana to support a period of research at the Fundación Carpentier, which held Carpentier's library. It was actually his house in the Vedado district of Havana, which housed his personal library, as well as, I think, most of his manuscripts, if not all of his manuscripts. And then the other research trip I anticipated was to go to Chile in order to spend some time looking through the archives at the Universidad de Chile, but also to visit some of Neruda's favorite places, and particularly to look around his houses in Santiago, Valparaiso, and also in Isla Negra, which were full of his sort of botanical objects, drawings, and also plants. So for the remaining time, I want to look at a couple of examples of the plant-related materials I find in my trips to these archives. Some of these I anticipated and actively looked for among the archives, and others were a surprise for me and supported my arguments, or actually took them in a new direction in ways that I didn't necessarily expect. So if I just start with Alejo Carpentier, this research trip to Cuba took place over Christmas and New Year 2017-2018. And I was based in Havana and spent most of my time at the Fundación Alejo Carpentier, which, as I said, was Carpentier's. I think it was one of his former houses. I think he had a number, and this holds his extensive archive. Lots of people work there. It's kind of jam packed with his books, with his manuscripts. It's a really amazing place, and it's also very much like the house he used to live in. So I find myself being really starstruck every time I kind of walked into Alejo Carpentier's bathroom and this kind of thing. So it was for me, it was a fantastic kind of experience. Now, my main objective in going to this archive was to see what plant-related books the author held in his library, what possible annotations these books on these books might tell me about his knowledge of plants, and also, what kind of evidence there was of his interest in plants amongst his manuscripts. Did he make interesting changes? I was kind of open to see what I could see. And my focus on this chapter on Carpentier was what I had termed early on in the writing of the chapter as the vegetal Baroque. The chapter focused on the ways in which Carpentier's New World Baroque was inflected with botanical forms and terminology. And when I went to Cuba, I actually had a substantial draft of chapter 3, but I wanted to find out more about Carpentier's reading and thinking of the Baroque. in order to sort of back up certain parts of my argument. So one of my interests before arriving in Havana had been Carpentier's focus on architecture as an instantiation of the New World Baroque. Not only are many of the buildings he includes in his fictional and non-fictional writings Baroque per se, but many also exemplify Baroque characteristics such as the trope of engaño or deception, when what seem to be man-made structures turn out to be natural forms and vice versa. This is one of, for those of you who know Carpentier's work, this is one of his kind of, lifelong concerns. One of the texts that explores this question is Carpentier's 1964 essay, La Ciudad de las Columnas, in which Havana is central, with the city's buildings and monuments providing fruitful examples of the coalescence between plants and the built environment. And I remember walking to Carpentier's archive for the first time and seeing so many instances of what I had come to call the vegetal Baroque around me, especially, pillars adorned with vegetal embellishments. You can see some examples here, such as fluting to represent bark, foliation, such as acanthus leaves on capitals. And in his essay, La Ciudad de las Columnas, Carpentier noted the preponderance of botanical motifs in the houses of the Havana suburbs. He talks about the white grills with its profusion of metal ribbons entangled like vegetation. And this picture of this particular grill is actually from Carpentier's own house. He also talks about the patios where the vegetation merges with the domestic architecture. And you'll see a picture a little bit later of Carpentier's own patio. And this is a picture of his house. So this is the La Fundación Carpentier in Havana. And you can see it's a very grand house. And it has lots of vegetal embellishments on its window grills, as well as plaster festoons of flowers, foliated Doric columns, voluted consoles flanking its grand front steps. There we go. If I just show you some more pictures, you can see the side of it, and this is a kind of typical Havana scene where you have on the one hand this incredibly grand building, and then a house beside it which is much less grand. And this was the house across the road from Carpentier's house, which doesn't have so much of the kind of fancy columns or anything like that, but does actually have a tree effectively growing out of it. So, there are lots of different ways in which buildings become vegetal in Havana. This was Carpentier's patio as well, which again, one of his obsessions was the way in which the palm trunk or trunks of various trees could merge with or seem like columns. So unfortunately in his patio, it wasn't playing ball. There wasn't a kind of huge tree there, but there were some smaller trees. But they did seem to relate to some of his writings on the Baroque. And this is a volute. You can see in the picture, which is the volute, was to the side of his front steps. And the volute was seen by Carpentier as a really important Baroque decoration. He talks about volute several times in his work, including in the important short story Viaje a la Semilla, also in El Siglo de las Luces. And although there's uncertainty about the origin of this architectural feature, it's been suggested that it derives from the shape of the ovule of a common species of Greek clover, but it's also been related to the unfurling of a fern for obvious reasons. So I remember that I wasn't able to access the library catalogue before going to the Fundación. And that was one of the sort of trickier aspects of working with archives in Cuba, that I tended to, when I was there, things tended to happen when I was actually there as opposed to in advance. And also the catalogue was quite sort of clunky. I remember it may have changed since then, but I couldn't apply very many filters to my search when I was there. So that involved me looking through many more books than perhaps I would have set out to do, because I couldn't kind of search for things that I was looking for in particular. And I felt that serendipity, therefore, had quite a role to play in that particular archive visit. So I tended to kind of flick through, I tended to get lots and lots of things and then sort of flick through them quite quickly. But as I noted before, one of the interests of Carpentier was in the arboreal origins of pillars. And that was something I was trying to explore a little bit more when I was in Cuba. So I found myself, looking through all of the architectural guides that he had collected in his library, especially of European buildings, European churches. And you can see some examples of these are Carpentier's own books that you can see here. He also had a Spanish edition of Fraser's The Golden Bough, for instance, as well as this array of illustrated books and pamphlets on ecclesiastical architecture. Another book I came across was the 1975 French first edition of Roger Cook's beautifully illustrated esoteric art book, The Tree of Life. Carpentier was very, very helpful because as an author, because what he did was he sort of scribbled on his books. He turned down pages, he underlined things, he sometimes disagreed with things as well, and would write sort of cross comments in the margins. So it was really a dream in many ways, because you could therefore trace what he had been reading, and also how he was responding to what he was reading. And actually, in the case of this particular book, I remember, flicking through it. It wasn't a book I'd seen before, in fact, but then afterwards I got hold of a copy in English, and find it incredibly helpful in terms of the way in which it talked about the tree of life. But he had actually turned down the corner of this page that you see featured here, marking a chapter on the tree of fertility. And this chapter contained an account of the ancient Egyptian myth of Osiris and Isis, and had a corresponding sketch of the Djed pillar. And according to Plutarch's rendering of this tale, this column formed when a tree grew around a chest containing the body of the slain Osiris, and was later used to hold up the roof of a palace. So again, you have this wonderful illustration of this kind of tree column, which fitted in very well with the arguments I was, putting forward about Carpentier and this coalescence between the built environment and nature in his work more broadly. Another text that was really interesting to find in his archive, not surprising to find it, but really interesting to see his annotations, was Lydia Cabrera's El Monte. This is a text that many of you might have heard of, very important book about Afro-Cuban knowledge of plants and mostly plants, carried out from field work that was drawn on field work from the 1930s and 40s. And actually we can see that this book had been dedicated to Carpentier by the author, and Carpentier made lots of annotations in the text, including about some of the plants that he refers to in his work. So again, it was very useful for me, because I could see that he'd, for instance, we have a page 497, you can see there, he's turned the page corner down, and this is a page in which the plant Orteguilla features. And actually, this is a really key plant in El Siglo de las Luces, in one of the scenes in which there's a secret physic garden discovered in the book, and it's subsequently destroyed by a Haitian doctor when he's treating the asthma of the main character, Esteban. And this is one of the plants that features in the list of plants that is contained in that garden. And Cabrera here records how the locally named Orteguilla was a singularly malign plant, which, for instance, when combined in a potion with hair follicles, fingernails, and a donkey's nose, was believed to cause impotence in anyone who imbibed it. So, suddenly this opens up a whole other reading of these texts and deepens your understanding of what Carpentier knew about these plants. And then there were other texts that I didn't really know about, that I wasn't really expecting to find. For instance, this is a really, really interesting account of the Baroque by the Catalan art critic Eugenio Dors. And again, you can see that Carpentier annotated this text. It was obviously an important text for him. It was annotated quite substantially throughout. And I can't quite remember, but I don't think this was a book that I was particularly familiar with, or at least hadn't spent a long time thinking about before I went to the archive. But afterwards, it was a book that I paid a lot of attention to and read and integrated into my arguments much more thoroughly. Again, you can see Carpentier, sort of as kind of critic in these texts as well. So, disagreeing and so on. So it's extremely helpful when you find those sorts of things, those kind of annotations in a text. And then The final thing I want to share with you about my trip to Cuba is just to talk very briefly about my experience of the manuscripts in the Fundación Carpentier. So that was also one of my intentions, as well as looking at his personal library. I wanted to look at the manuscripts, and the archive held a wealth of materials and manuscripts at many different stages. I soon realized, in fact, that it was going to be challenging to really deal with all the manuscripts that were there. And I had started off, with a very ambitious list of things that I planned to look at, but this quickly kind of dwindled as I realized that there were just thousands and thousands of pages to deal with. So I trawled through quite a lot of them, and I found things that I felt were interesting, but actually in the end, I've just sort of got photographs of, and I've put them away for another time. But one thing I did find in the manuscripts that had a sort of impact on my argument, I suppose, was this following page. So this was, for those of you who know the novel, this particular page of Los Pasos Perdidos relates to the narrator's first meeting with the Adelantado, who is this founder of cities in the novel. And basically, this is quite an important moment in the novel, and especially important in the way in which it presents plants and presents the jungle as a kind of closed world within the novel. So I think from what I can remember, I think I'd kind of ended up sort of thinking, well, I can't look at all the manuscripts and there's so many different versions. So I think I'll pick out some key passages and I'll look at those and see what I can find. So I had picked this key passage out in my copy of the novel, and then I'd gone to the manuscripts and had a look. And when I was reading through this page, suddenly these X's, I think there are 19 of them, jumped out at me because I could see that he'd made some sort of change here. And actually, if you look really carefully, you can see that what he'd crossed out was the term lo barroco vegetal, which for me was really significant because this was the term that I had been using for quite a long time to think about Carpentier's approach to the Baroque, but is not a term that he uses anywhere else that I'm aware of. So going back to the original piece, you can see that this change clearly took place at the original moment of typing, because it's replaced by the type phrase grandes barroquismos tellúricos, and then the article los has been inserted later in pencil, perhaps at a later correcting stage. And this still survives in the published version of the novel. So actually, this change became really significant for me in terms of my thinking about Carpentier's botanical imagination, and this little moment in the text formed the basis for my conclusion to that chapter. It as I said, I'd already chosen the term the vegetable Baroque to characterize Carpentier's twin interests in plants and Baroque stylistics. So somehow to see it expressed like this and then deleted became this quite sort of pleasing, but also very perplexing kind of moment for me, and helped me tease out some of the complexities of Carpentier's approach to plants and the Baroque more broadly. So I'm going to move on to Chile now. So brief look at Cuba and going to move on to Chile. So just to sort of the background to this particular trip. So I made this trip about 6 months after my trip to Cuba. So I was a bit more seasoned in some ways in terms of my work in the archive. But on the other hand, for various reasons, my thinking about Neruda was at a much earlier stage when I went to Chile. And I think that both was a good thing and a bad thing, actually. So whilst when I was in Cuba, I'd already really thought through quite a lot of the issues around Carpentier's relationship with the Baroque and plants. With Neruda, I hadn't written very much of that chapter. I hadn't really thought through many of the issues. So I had fewer preconceived ideas about what I might find in Chile and how these might relate to the poet's work. But then on the other hand, that meant that my focus was sort of broader, which meant that I explored lots of avenues that in the end didn't really finally feature in the book. In terms of thinking about Neruda's relationship to plants, for those of you who don't know Neruda perhaps too well or associate him more with oceans, that's certainly how I started thinking about Neruda. He's often regarded as a poet of oceans. So, we have lots of oceanic imagery in his poetry. He also has renowned collections of excuse me, of seashells, many of which I saw when I was in Chile and visiting his houses. You know, shells were kind of everywhere, and also other nautical equipment. In Isla Negra in particular, his house is very boat-like. There's lots of kind of boat-like furnishings as well. And you have lots of photographs of Neruda kind of stumbling around on rocks and by the Pacific coast. But in my chapter, in this book, I obviously didn't want to focus on that. I wanted to focus on Neruda's less explored side, which was his interest in botany and his detailed knowledge of plants, his sometimes obsessive referencing to plants. Plants are fundamental to Neruda's poetry, particularly the Canto General, which was mostly the focus of the chapter that I was working on when I went to Chile. And again, the language of plants and their constituent elements, so not just the sort of plants themselves, but, you know, their roots, the stamens, the petals, the seeds, branches, permeate the entire Canto General, as does the sense of the vegetal world as animate and closely related to the human. So central to the chapter when I went to Chile, and central to what I was hoping to do, was to explore Neruda's role as a poet-botanist, particularly, as I say, in the Canto General, as well as in a number of his essays and autobiographical writings. I wanted to examine how and why specific trees and plants, including Chilean flora, played a role in his writings, and also to uncover connections between his botanical reading and his use of root and seed symbolism. So I didn't necessarily achieve all of those things, but that was my kind of main points of interest when I went to Chile. And aside from my visit to the archive at the University of Chile, which I'll discuss in a moment, another aim for me when I was in Chile was to spend time in Neruda's houses. You can see my picture of myself outside one of his houses, which again was a bit of a like superstar moment, sort of finding myself in Chile and so close to, you know, this poet that I'd read for many years. All of these houses, so you've got a picture here of La Chascona, and then the central house is his house in Valparaiso, and the bottom house was his house in Isla Negra. And all of them, you know, centrally featured kind of gardens, but also wood was very important in each of the houses. And I'll say a little bit about wood in a moment, but just to show you the kind of settings for these houses. Again, you can see the Chilean flora very obviously in the background in Isla Negra. Likewise, the gardens in the Valparaiso house, though small, were quite distinctive. And this is his house, La Chascona in Santiago, which felt a bit like a tree house to me in many ways. You can almost see the sort of, you know, the use of wood in this particular house. Wood is very important for Neruda. And this is, you know, both the living wood of forest trees, the rotten dead wood of fallen trunks, timber used to construct his homes, his childhood homes and his adult homes as well. And these are a central point of reference across his autobiographical writings and poetry. And one of the primary ways in which Neruda often signals his close connections to nature. In a speech marking his 50th birthday, Neruda recalled how he had written early verses of poetry on the walls of his wooden frontier home in the south of Chile. He talks about how he was attracted by the texture of the wood. He talks about this a number of times in different writings, in different poems, about how he actually wrote directly on the wood itself. He talks, for instance, when he's trekking over the Andes into exile, into his kind of well-known exile in the 1940s. Again, Neruda talks about how he carved his initials on the bark of the last tree in Chile, as he called it. And his descriptions of writing directly on wooden surfaces emphasize the organicism of his poetry, which he said springs from un impulso vegetal, unmediated by culture. So when I was visiting his houses, and unfortunately I couldn't take any pictures in the inside of the houses because that was strictly not allowed. So I was just itching to take pictures because there were so many trees, so many wooden sculptures, just so many things of interest. But you can see some of these online, and I also had some books that I was able to buy that I could see sort of photos of the interiors of the houses. But certainly this love of wood, the importance of wood to Neruda and to Neruda's poetry was really evident across the houses, and particularly in La Chascona. And you can see this picture of the living room in his Santiago home, where you have a tree trunk, unusually, right in the middle of the room with the telephone at the bottom. Likewise, in Isla Negra, you have, wooden ceilings, wooden floors, and walls, all constructed from Chilean timber. And in her memoirs, the poet's third wife, Matilde Urrutia, remembered Pablo Neruda going out and collecting driftwood, often making furniture out of wood and collecting these, natural sculptures as artworks for the house. So this was one part of what I was doing, was just kind of trying to trace, the way in which Neruda was kind of steeped in plants in his life as well as his work. In terms of the archival work I did in Chile, it was pretty much the opposite of my experience in Cuba, where I couldn't really do anything in advance and had to wait until I got there. In contrast, I seem to remember before I went to Chile, emailing the archive and then doing a little bit of work and finding out that I could download the library catalogue, which was 236 pages long, this list of Neruda's works, his own personal library that he had donated to the University of Chile in 1954. So obviously that was a little bit daunting. I had to then, again, I can't quite remember how I did it, but I think I just kind of trawled through all the books and, looked for some key terms. And I think I narrowed it down to around 50 books in particular, because I didn't have time to ask to see many more, but also didn't have time to dedicate myself to the task of reading and looking carefully at more than around 50 books. I also remember that I requested to see all the copies Neruda had of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, which was an important work for him. And that was that was perhaps one of the less useful things that I did, because actually he had lots and lots of editions of Leaves of Grass, but it was never clear which, they were all antiquarian, and it was unclear that whether the annotations were his own or someone else's. So that was one of perhaps the less useful things I did. Among the poet's personal library, which, as I said, was donated to the University of Chile in 1954, I looked at just lots and lots of botanical works. This is the archive where I was working, a really stunning environment in which to work, as you can see. And these are some of the books he had. So he was a real collector of books. Some of the books were books that he was reading, but also you can see from these kind of books that there were books that he was collecting as well. So this really large tome, the first one here, is a 1596 Czech translation of Pietro Andrea Mattioli's Materia Medica, which was just packed with botanical woodcuts, a really impressive book. And then these other books was a multi-volume account of Flora Española. And, there were just so many books amongst his archive relating to plants, an array of scientific books, comic books. You can see here some 19th century sort of, comic florographical texts with some beautiful illustrations. Also very practical gardening books, which took me a bit by surprise. So, books like Gardens in Colour with, suggestions for Valentine's Day displays, which I wasn't quite sure what to do with, or even things, well, this was a beautiful book, actually, European Ferns, but, a book like Garden Bulbs in Colour. So he wasn't above just practical gardening books either, but he did have a wide range of botanical texts. And in his speech to mark his donation to the University of Chile, the poet offered an explanation for the large number of books about plants. He said, that many people would ask why there were so many books about plants amongst the collection. And he said quite simply, La contestación está en mi poesía, which I liked. So, you have to look for the answer in his poetry. So, unlike Carpentier, Neruda didn't annotate any of his books, as far as I could see, really, very, very few. And that was something that Neruda specialist Daria Oces, who is the director at the library at the Fundación Pablo Neruda, and based in the Poets Santiago house, told me in advance of my visit to this archive. And I sort of hoped he was wrong, but actually he was right. So there were very, very few annotations. But I think that meant that the annotations that there were particularly significant, that something had sparked an interest so much that, that he'd annotated this text. So that happened a few times, and I'll show you some of those annotations. Now, that certainly made it more challenging because it was difficult to know if the poet had read many of the books that I was looking at, if they were at all significant to him. Also, the fact that they had been donated to the University of Chile in 1954. Well, these were not books like Carpentier's books that had been in his library all his life that he looked at over a period of years. These were actually books that he'd donated in the 50s. So there was quite a limited window when he would have been reading these books, although it could, certainly the Canto General was published in 1950, so he would have looked at those books potentially before that key work was published. And as I said, some of them were clearly valued by the poet simply for their rarity and their beauty, rather than perhaps their content. If I just think about one example in particular of something I was looking for when I was in Chile, one of the persistent botanical metaphors across Neruda's fictional and non-fictional writing is this idea of the poem as a seed and as the poet as a sower of seeds. So there are lots of examples of this across Neruda's work, but in the Canto General, for instance, Neruda styles himself as a farmer in possession of seeds, which can sow hope for future generations. And this idea of Neruda as a sower of seeds, particularly as a sower of semillas insurgentes, is something that crops up throughout his work. So I wanted to really see if I could find out a little bit more about his knowledge of seeds, if any of his botanical books contained reference to seeds and what sort of things they said about seeds. And actually, it was really interesting to find this particular book amongst the archive. So this was a now quite obscure botanical book. We've got the Spanish version here, La Tierra es Verde, but the original is in English, and it's Harold William Ricketts, A Green Earth, An Invitation to Botany, first published in 1943. And Ricketts was a noted 20th century botanist who was working as a bibliographer at the New York Botanical Gardens when he published the book. And effectively, it's quite a straightforward book. It's in terms of its botanical information, it's full of information about how plants grow, feed, and reproduce. And it's largely aimed at amateur botanists. So it's quite scientific, but not too much. And like I say, although the poet didn't often annotate his books, this book was annotated quite substantially. And in particular, a chapter on plant growth contains multiple underlinings, which I'll show you in a moment, especially relating to seeds. So this particular chapter that's heavily annotated begins in a way that directly anticipates Neruda's later self-styling as a farmer. And I'll just read the English version. Neruda would have read the Spanish, but this is the original of the text. I know a man who is a poet. It is true that he would not know himself by such a title, for he does not write verse. He is a farmer. He is a poet because he knows the joy of creation, and never failing delight is the appearance of living, growing plants in a patch of dirt where only a few days before he has placed some dry grains. So although here the metaphor is reversed in Ricketts' account, so we have the farmer as poet rather than vice versa, the confluence between Neruda's imagination of himself as this sower of semillas insurgentes and Ricketts' botanical text was immediately suggestive to me in terms of the poet's continued appeal to plants as a mean to define his poetic vocation. So if we just look at another page from this text, again, you see these underlinings, which was really, really unusual amongst Neruda's works. And this seemed to me to be quite compelling evidence of the way in which Neruda had a particular interest in seeds. Lots of people, Neruda himself commented that, he was kind of obsessed with roots in his work. But actually seeds seemed to me, when I was reading the Canto General, as an equally important theme. And again, the poet's annotations reveal this interest in how seeds in particular mature through their division, through the division of their nuclei. So if I just read, if you can see the underlining, and if I just read the English original alongside, So Neruda's Spanish copy of the book refers to the seeds, underlinings refer to the seed's wonderful ability to divide itself into two. We also have the statement, the nucleus first divides itself into two nuclei. And further down in the same page, we have the sentence describing the growth of plant cells being underlined. The result of this rapid geometric progression is a body of very small cells actively dividing and enlarging. So this obviously really captured his imagination in some way. Whilst roots were used in Neruda's poetry to emphasize integration and contraction, often across racial or geographical lines, seeds tended to function the other way around. So as Ricketts' botanical work made clear for Neruda, seeds grow through multiplication and expansion. As a model for human life, seeds suggest the hope of building from small beginnings, as well as, like roots, the power of regeneration and resurrection. Ricketts' account of the seed in a green earth resonates in productive ways with the poet's treatment of life and death in the Canto General, as when the botanist sets out in one section of the book, this is a quote from Ricketts, he says how the ancients believed that the planted seed must first die. A miraculous resurrection occurs in the soil. The seed springs to life again and shapes itself in the image of its ancestors. That's a quote from Ricketts. And again, we can, I could see lots of examples in the Canto General of how this sort of thinking about seeds and the idea of seed as resurrection is sort of dovetails with some of Neruda's verses. And I'll just give you one example. So this is from a poem called El Empalado, which was part of Neruda's extended consideration of the life and death of the Araucanian chief Caupolicán in Los Libertadores. And he talks here in this poem about how the seed is a symbol of hope in the face of the warrior's death. He says, En las entrañas de mi patria entraba la punta asesina, hiriendo las tierras sagradas. La sangre quemante caía de silencio en silencio abajo, hacia donde está la semilla, esperando la primavera. And this idea of the seed awaiting the spring is actually something that we see in much of Neruda's poetry, even some of his later poetry as well. So, that's just one example of how being in the archives and how seeing some of the poet's kind of annotations and underlinings can really help to give a focus to your research, can help reveal things that perhaps you hadn't fully anticipated or thought about. And I just want to end. I'm pretty much finished, but I just wanted to end with one final piece of advice or a reflection on my own experience in the archive, which is really the importance of speaking to staff in the archives as much as possible, because often in Cuba and Chile, people brought me books that I didn't request, particularly in Cuba. So I used to just be sort of sitting, working my way through all these things and feeling like I was never, ever going to get to the bottom of my pile of books. And then, different people from the Fundación Carpentier would sort of come along and they'd kind of plonk a little book down beside me and say, have you looked in this book? Have you thought about this book? Because of course, the staff in these libraries and archives are very knowledgeable about not only the authors, but actually what the books contain. And often this took me in a new direction, and I learned things I wasn't expecting, and I wouldn't probably have called up many of those books. And this happened to me in Chile as well. So the book that you can see in front of you was this beautiful 19th century handmade herbario, it was called, Album Pintoresco Herbario. And this was presented to me by someone in the Archivo Andrés Bello. When I sort of thought I'd worked my way through all the books, they said, oh, there's this book we haven't catalogued yet that belonged to Neruda. We don't know if it's interesting for you, but we'll show it to you because you're interested in plants. So they brought out this book. And I mean, it was just the most sort of stunning book, really. So you both have these kind of set pieces of, kind of plant decoration, but also landscapes which are composed of plant matter. If you look really carefully at some of the close-ups, you'll see that every single thing, almost, I think we've got a bit of painting there, but most of these pictures are completely composed of little bits of plants, delicately arranged. And, you can even see the kind of level of detail. You can see the spores of the ferns and so on. And in terms of texture, I've tried to take a picture from the side, which doesn't quite show you, but it really texturally, it was really interesting as well. So this is just a note to say, I never would have seen this book. I would never have called this book up. But this was just one of those kind of moments of serendipity in archival research, which can sometimes happen, that you go down a road you weren't expecting to go down. And it didn't necessarily change the course of my chapter on Neruda, but I think it did deepen my understanding of the poet and the sort of, again, his obsession with the kind of minutiae of plant life that you can see reflected in a work like this. So I think that's where I'm going to end, Liz, just on that point. I'm not sure how I'm doing for time and whether there's any time left. I think I may have talked a bit too long, but very happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Lesley. That was really, really interesting, and so many great points there that I have lots of questions, but I will leave the floor open. We probably can take a couple of quick questions. So please feel free to either virtually raise your hand or pop something in the chat if you have any questions for Lesley about that presentation. I think there were some really great reflections in there, not only on how to trace some of those plant roots in existing pieces of literature, and especially in your case, but also the sort of logistical challenges and moments of serendipity that we can find when we're doing this kind of research, especially in archives. So please go ahead if any of you have any questions, and they can be methodological questions as well as in more, I guess, intellectual ones as well. Yes, Oscar has a question. Please go ahead, unmute yourself.
Hi, Lesley. Thank you very much for this wonderful talk and walking us through your process. I was just wondering. So you mentioned that when you went to Chile, you didn't have a lot of preconceived directions or predetermined directions on where you were going to go, and that you explored many different areas that at the end didn't make it to the book. I mean, especially for like junior scholars, how did you decide? How did the process of deciding what was going to go in the book work for you? And are you thinking of exploring these other ideas in other formats, or what do you, or do you just not gonna touch that material anymore?
Thank you very much for that question. Actually, I have to say it's been really nice to do this presentation, because I finished the research for the book a few years ago, and I've never really been able to sort of show all these photographs to anybody. I just took thousands of photographs in the archives, because I had this feeling that I might never be back, in either archive again. I hope I will be someday, but I did have that sense that I had to record as much as I possibly could amongst the manuscripts in Cuba, Los Pasos Perdidos and so on, in case I come back to those works, but from a different perspective in the future. So sometimes it was just a kind of question of kind of collecting as much as I could and then, focusing in on things. What to select, what to put in a chapter and what not to is a really difficult question. I'm not even sure I can answer that. It was just, it was the final chapter of the book. So in a way, once, as I was finalizing the book, there were certain themes that emerged across the book that it felt important to continue addressing. And that excluded certain elements, I suppose. And then, just the sort of, in a way, that material, that underlining in the Ricketts book helped. Perhaps it wasn't hugely significant in some ways in a kind of archival sense, but for me, it focused my attention on the idea of seeds and the idea of roots. And that became a really important focus for me, and therefore meant that some of the other material sort of had to be excluded. but I do keep all this material. I think it's really important to keep all of the work that you've sort of ever done, actually, in terms of archival work, but even other scholarly work. And and if I make a cut in an article or in a chapter, I always kind of keep it somewhere and think, someday I'll come back to that. Someday it might feed into something new. So I do think that, especially in the case of some of the work I did in Cuba, that there are books that and annotations that Carpentier made and some of the texts that weren't really relevant at all to this project, but I really want to explore another time. And, hopefully that time will come at some future point. But thank you. I think that's a really important question, actually.
Great, thank you both so much. Any other final questions for Lesley before we move on? Okay, in the interest of timing, I think we should probably move to our next segment. But Lesley, thank you so much for your presentation. I hope we can all give you a little virtual round of applause quickly. I can't find all my reactions. There we go. Thank you very much. That you showed at the end is just amazing, and I would love to see it in person. The herbario. Anyway, we're now going to hear very briefly from Iris Backman, who is based at the British Library, who's just going to tell us all very briefly a bit about how to access the British Library collections for any of you in the audience that might not be familiar with them or might not have thought about using them for plant humanities work before. So Iris, please take it away whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for the invitation as well to be part of this event. And I think Lesley's final words were quite fitting because Lesley said, do ask the staff. And I think as curator of the Latin American collections at the British Library, I can only just reiterate and reinforce that our staff at the reference desks are superb in finding things in the catalogues, and they are very happy to help you when you come to the British Library and might have difficulties with the catalogue because all catalogues have their tricks and problems, and changing them from one platform to another often screws up the information further. So yes, please do come and ask. So just briefly, I'm the curator for Latin American collections at the British Library, looking after the collections from 19 countries in Latin America. The British Library, which started really as the British Museum Library in 1753, has been collecting materials from Latin America since the very beginning. And when you come to the British Library, you will see 4 busts of our founding libraries, and I think we might hear more in the talk about Kew Gardens later on. So founder libraries at the British Library are King George III Library, Cotton, Banks, Granville, and Sloane. And of course, Hans Sloane and Banks were great botanists and such quite important for plant humanities today as well. The libraries and items from Banks and Sloane's are spread over or across the British Museum, the Natural History Museum, and the British Library, and then also Kew Gardens. But we do have a wide range of materials from and about Latin America at the British Library, from early printed books and manuscripts from the 16th century on to really a wide range of books that keep growing with publications every year into the 21st century. And I think of particular interest, perhaps to scholars of plant humanities, are materials relating to natural history, travel writing, and we have a quite large collection of travel writing from the 19th century, both from within the Americas and from Europe. And then you will find broad collecting of publications, sound materials, maps from all Latin American countries in the areas of literature, humanities, social science, and to a lesser degree also science and medicine, from particularly the mid-19th century onwards. And I still find it astonishing every day I look after the collections, just the sheer volume and immensity and diversity of materials you can find. And I think one of the interesting aspects at the British Library is that you can, of course, also compare with collections from other geographical areas, of course, relating to British Empire. I mean, the British Library, of course, has huge materials as well from Asia and Africa. In fact, 40% of our materials are from that area. And just finally, to say some of the older materials are available online as well through Google digitizations. And you can search that in the catalog. I will pop a couple of links into the chat in a minute. And then finally, just to say the British Library is for everyone, everyone over the age of 18. So not for everyone, I guess, can get a reader pass. You just have to come. You can start the process online. You just need 2 bits of documents, and then you can get started exploring our vast collections. And as I said, the people at the reference desks are usually incredibly helpful. There's a chat function as well to ask them questions. But if you have very specific questions, perhaps relating to plant humanities, I'll also pop my email in the chat. Feel free to contact me as well. And yeah, that's really all I wanted to say.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Iris. That's really, really helpful. And I'm already hearing so many parallels between what you've just said and some of the things I imagine Kristen will talk about in relation to Dumbarton Oaks later on. That's really brilliant. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We're scheduled now to have a break until 3:20. But I can see that Catherine Davies has just put a really interesting question for Lesley in the chat. And Lesley, I'm not sure if you need to run now, or if you have a minute to answer that question. But yeah, if you'd
I'm just composing something, so I'll just have it'll be a short response because I do have to go early, unfortunately. But I will, because that's a really good question. Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, thank you both so much, Iris and Lesley, for rounding off this first half of the workshop. So please, everyone, go and grab a cup of tea or stretch your legs or whatever you'd like to do in the next 20 minutes. And we will see you all back here for our next presentation. You're welcome to stay in the room and turn off your camera and mute your microphone if you'd like to, or you can leave and rejoin. I believe we'll keep an eye on the waiting room. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I can see, looks like most of us are still in the room, which is fantastic. Thanks again for returning to the session, and welcome to those of you who joined perhaps slightly after we started. So we're going to move on to our next presentation session now, where we're going to be hearing from Luciano Martinez and Lindsay Sakulovitz. Luciana is based at Warwick, University of London, and Lindsay is based as a practicing artist and joint based between Kew and the University of Brighton. And they're going to be telling us about a collaborative plant humanities project that they've been engaged in. And the title of their presentation is Biocultural Collections, learning to work together. So please go ahead and share your screen whenever you're ready and take it away.
Thanks. Let me just start there. Yeah, thanks, Liz, for inviting us to be here. It's a great pleasure, really, to share more about our project together, and for Lindsay as well to accept to doing this in a shared presentation. So this project, in fact, a long now research program that we've been developing with Kew Gardens since 2015. And it's a collaborative project together with the Botanic Garden in Rio, with the Instituto Socioambiental, which is an NGO they're based in São Paulo, but they work all over Brazil, and several other institutions, including the Federation of the Organization of the Indigenous Peoples of the Rio Negro region. My work as a researcher is very much based on kind of the visual and material archive of exploration in Latin America from the 19th and to the 20th centuries. And this research, part of it, is part of that project, because one of my case studies is Richard Spruce, that we are going to hear about that. And this is a research that was also supported by the Leverhulme Fellowship. So I'd just like to start say a little bit about what are those biocultural collections. They are very much, this biocultural archive this is a term that has been used currently about collections that includes biological specimens, plant and animal-based artifacts, and associated texts and images that they are found in different kinds of collections, and normally they are considered separately. So what we are doing in this project is try to connect those disparate connections. And they are, in the 19th century, they were called kind of economic botany collections, the 20th century ethnobotanical collections. And what are they? I mean, the ones that we are working on where this research program started was with the collections of the botanist Richard Spruce, who spent 15 years traveling in South America from, the very mouth of the Amazon, and he went up the Rio Negro, he went to the Huapés, and up to the Orinoco as well, went down and went to Solimões, and then he went to the Andes, where he collected cinchona, and then came back to Britain. So, he really traveled extensively in Latin America, and he collected a lot of specimens, 14,000 herbarium specimens, including that I found recently several fungi. He collected 350 ethnobotanical artifacts, lots of notes, journals, drawings, and vocabularies of 21 indigenous languages. So he did a kind of very comprehensive work in the region. Most of his collections are now deposited in institutions in London, including the Robert and Gardens Kew, the British Museum, the Natural History Museum as well. The Royal Society has mostly the drawings, and also the Manchester Museum Herbarium and Manchester Central Library have materials about spruce. So spruce, the artifacts that we are most concerned with in this project, they were collected for the Museum of Economic Botany that was created in the kind of 1847, and it was to show, to the British public the uses of plants all over the world. So it was at the beginning of that collection that Spruce was contributing to sending those artifacts to Richard Spruce. So here we have, Lindsay holding some of the samples of these collections. Which is Astrocaria vulgare. This is something interesting because it's the economic Botany collection that has these artifacts, and it's of course, classified by plants. So, you really do need to have some kind of botanical knowledge to navigate the collections. But he collected, for example, the rings made of these plants, collected the cords and the kind of the fruit as well. So that's what we mean, by this biocultural collection. So it's kind of several different ways of using the plant. One thing that was very, very interesting about Spruce's way of collecting is that he was very meticulous, and he really referenced the plant specimen to the artifact collected. And he also did very kind of detailed labels, as you can see here. It says handsome spreading tree. So, he has details of the tree. Talk about the milk exceedingly copious, red. So that he gives information about the color. About the tasteless, the texture becoming solid, and that you can rub in powder with the finger. So it's also very tactile, his descriptions. And again, the colors, the flowers are pale yellow with strong odor of vanilla. So we can see you get a little bit of this kind of forest environment in just one little label, which is I think fantastic, really, in terms of bringing back the experience of being in the field, and of course the fact that you can recover the plant, the link the herbarium specimen with the artifact as well. So there's quite a lot there. So this, as I said, this is a research program that we have been getting small bits of funding from several places. One of them was the most recently one was the British Academy, the Knowledge Frontiers scheme. And after that project, we just put in a big grant application for the ERC. And these are the research questions that we put in this latest proposal, which is, how can the natural and cultural collections originating in Amazonia be reimagined and reassembled in ways that reflect and enable a better understanding of indigenous heritage? And here, what we are thinking about is really, how can we trace the way that the collections were distributed and separated, and in the way, the way that artifacts were made within the indigenous ontologies. How can you recover that? And this especially thinking about, more current developments in ethnography, talking about the multi-species in Anthropocene. What we see is that there is a kind of a correlation to the way that indigenous peoples think about plants with these new developments in anthropology. So how can you, use those collections to make these come back together? So the other question is, in what ways can biocultural collections be mobilized as catalysts for the retelling of stories about the relations between indigenous peoples and other human and non-human beings and ecological processes more broadly, which is related to the first one? And what role can creative practice play in the presentation of biocultural heritage? And this is where kind of Lindsay comes in, with great help for us. And how can innovative museological approaches to exhibition curatorship, working across scientific and world culture collections, reactivate historical biocultural objects in order to address contemporary environmental challenge? So it is a more kind of museological question, really. How can you make those collections speak to challenges of the 21st century? So I'm going now to pass the word to Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you, Luciana. Yeah, that's great. That's sort of brilliantly describing sort of almost where we're at up to now. So I'm sort of going to step back a little bit in time to say that when I started the project in 2017, I'd been working already for, sort of to give a bit of background on my work, because I think it's probably quite an unusual sort of role I'm taking here, as being doing a practice-based study, as I am now. So I'd been working for 10 years before beginning with work on this project with usually with entomologists and doing lots of field studies, and then also doing various residencies and working in different museums and collections. I had found it quite difficult actually for a long time to be sort of unite almost the two sides of my work, and how I could really bring together the idea of the field work and the archive work. And I found that when I started working with plants and working with herbariums, that this was that I had really sort of a subject that felt like it could work. And I think it was part of this is a kind of poppy that was in the high plains in Tibet, and I felt like the kind of luminous flower, as it is in life, equally has something else in the herbarium specimen. And I thought that transformation from the plant to the specimen, and almost the history that it told, the information that the plant told, that meant that the sites were then equal, and that the role operating between them sort of had new possibilities. And so for the next slide, Luciana, thank you. So this was a series that I'd been working on right before coming to Kew, and it was in Ethiopia, where I'd been working for a few years, and based in the herbarium, at the National Herbarium there. And I almost wanted to introduce this sort of slide to say that this was a project that had been very close to my heart, and I'd been working on it for several years, and it would go, and it wouldn't go anywhere, no matter how far I pushed it, how often I went, how much funding I applied for it. Basically, I had written some huge funding application and got told essentially, who cares? It relates to, nobody's interested. And I felt like it was documenting really important knowledge, traditional knowledge on plants, plant uses, and realizing that actually without that incredibly supportive network, that was Luciano and Mark Nesbitt and William Milliken, who were already, working in it. This project was already underway, that my involvement wouldn't have been possible. And I think that's almost, to sort of say an early challenge, is that sort of requirement of the network for in order to sort of start even the possibility of any collaborations. And then moving on. So this was my so after that initial introduction, then I received Arts Council funding to be in residence and work with the collection for a year. And so the sort of the first task, I suppose, was to find out what exactly it was that I was working with. So as Luciana has already said, there's 14,000 herbarium specimens and that he had collected, and 350 artifacts, and then a lot of prints and drawings and notes. And that is right, Luciana, am I forgetting or missing? So, and the herbarium, just to sort of say on the previous slide, I kind of, Luciana's described it recently, and I love this way of kind of calling it like a sort of geological slice. So that in these amazing, when you go in and you're working there, it's so quiet. And I think that at first it can feel like this static space, but then actually the more you work there, you realize that the specimens are containing not just the knowledge from when they were first collected or the knowledge there now, but almost mapping everything that's happened in between. And I think that kind of time being encompassed in specimens is what I find really exciting about working with them. So then if we go on, so this is some of the, my first task in a way was to just literally get through and see and hold and look at and understand what everything is and almost how it related to each other. So going from very significant ritual instruments, such as the shield that's in the center of this image, to then raw materials like the exactly resin and the cotton from the inside the seed pod, to then much more daily sort of objects like household brushes and small ceramic pieces. And so those combinations were quite fascinating, and also the difficulty from an outsider's perspective of knowing how things worked and operated sort of among themselves, from the artifacts, how they related to themselves. And then these extraordinary drawings that Spruce had made too, which are in the collections of the Royal Society. And Luciano's, you've worked in much more detail with these, haven't? Yeah.
It's amazing. I mean, because here, he named the indigenous people with their indigenous names, and in the Portuguese, I mean, the English names, I mean, he translates them, put the name in Portuguese as well, and the location, and who are they related to within the community, and so she's the niece of Kali, and he puts the age of them as well. So it's really a lot of information, and importantly for the project as well is he shows how the artifacts were used, and here he talks about the fact that the stone is on the kind of horizontal cut, because this was how the royalty in the community used it. And you can see here is not. So, there's lots of detailed ethnographic information as well that you can gather from Spruce drawings.
And also because with on that idea of the necklace, because he describes also how it's made by a palm stem being spun in sand and water. So it would have taken, months, I don't know, to drill the holes. And I think that was really important as well in thinking about the concept, like really early on for me, thinking about the concept of time and how these sort of haptics, other sort of understandings could work and were important in practice as well. So I think much like you, Luciano, it was really these kind of, and the sort of amazing thing was Bruce's collection of being able to sort of tie all these things together, and it's just very exciting to be able to do that. So this specimen of Licania octandra, which he described in his notes as being defective because somebody had climbed this very, very high tree to collect the leaves for him. And he said it was defective because it contained no flowers, but he still would send it back to Kew. And this was one of the earliest plants I looked for because it was very difficult to actually navigate the herbarium. And this was my kind of day of success of actually finding this plant. And then, it was, just that moment of realizing it was the one and the date was the same. And then it matched up as well with these ceramic vessels, and then the ashes from the clay, the ashes from the bark of the tree that are used to mix with clay in order to make the pottery. And so I started to follow processes or can remake processes, remake parts of things in order to understand more. So these are various different clays that I had also collected from different riverbeds, and all very different consistencies. And then I started to use equisetum in the place of the Licania, which would have a really high silica content. So a botanist had advised me that it would be the silica, which would be might be the property that was working with the ceramics. So I'd made charcoal out of the equisetum and then was mixing that with the ceramics. And these were some of the early pieces that I made. And it was really important then that they were unfired as well. And they still are. I've still not fired this series because I think at that time I felt like the possibility of return was really important to the works, that everything could almost go back to its natural state. And I didn't, and I sort of wanted to sort of understand more. And also I think paying attention to things such as the like things that are broken. On the one on the right hand side was broken, and I had to put it back together again. And actually realizing that the breaks were sort of told their own story and how to embrace that the kind of flaws as part of the process. And and then this was another sort of sequence working from these plants, Podostemaceae, which are river weeds. And I asked Luciano at the time if she had found anything about that Bruce had written in his notes about them, and you gave me this sort of wad of writing. And I mean, he loved them. It was he wrote so passionately about them, and talked about all the animals and that would come to feed off them, and the weeds which had been gathered, and then the salt was made from burning the weeds. And as I understand that they can only be gathered at very specific times of the season, and also the water moves so quickly that it's dangerous and difficult and slippery. And if you collect them too late in the day, the sun will come out and dry them and rot them. So in one of his specimens as well, there's just this little handwritten note attached to it to say, I was nearly too late for this fine thing, which is, really wonderful to sort of see then in drawing from it. And then these were some watercolors that were made from his specimens as well. And then I think the next, I'm kind of conscious to kind of time a little bit to go through, drawing from weaving some of the woven objects, I think is something that I'm doing a lot more of now. And then this drawing, using the natural materials, using the raw materials, I should say. This is the seed Bixa orellana that the pigment is contained inside. And he writes a lot about that, and that's what the plant that's used to make the sort of daily red colouring, sort of that you recognise, sort of body painting. And I made this very large painting wall drawing, which is about 2 meters wide, using these seeds, and they lost their intensity very quickly under light. So actually, as I was making it, it was almost the colour was coming away as well under the exposure to light. So it was quite a kind of the sort of ritual of making and disappearing.
Thanks, Lindsay. So what we are doing within this research program is to really reconnect the collections with the indigenous people. So the indigenous groups that we are working with, they are from the Upper Rio Negro region, which is near the frontier of Colombia and Venezuela in Brazil. And the reason why we are working on them is because Spruce collected quite a lot of materials. They are both of herbarium specimens and artifacts, and he really writes extensively about the peoples, including he drew a map of them. So we brought a kind of delegation of indigenous peoples to visit the collections, and this on the left-hand side here is the collections of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, because we are incorporating the collections by Kurt Grunberg, who went to the same region, but in the early 20th century, and he was working for the museum, and he collected many more museum specimens. So we can compare and have a kind of a study of how these artifacts changed. And also Kurt Grunberg had a photographic camera with him, and he took lots of photographs, so you can see how the artifacts were used as well. And an interesting thing is that we had planned at the beginning to bring just 3 of the indigenous peoples, and they asked for more too, because they wanted a kind of a chant specialist and a kumo as well, so they could, which is a kind of master of ceremony, so they could prepare everyone to look at these artifacts that have been collected so long ago, nearly 200 years ago, and all this time distant from their communities, and they were probably very angry. So they had to appease the souls of these artifacts and to be able to see them. So we had these rituals before entering into the collections, both in Kew and in Berlin, to be able to access those collections. And here we have both of them, Guilherme Tenor and Tarcísio Barreto, who are the chant specialist and the master of ceremony, kind of trying on those showing us how they use those artifacts. And here at Kew, we visited the herbarium, the archives and libraries, and the economic botany collection as well, where you can see our collaborators, William Milliken, Mark Nesbitt, and Viviane Cruel from Rio. We had, Aloysio Cabanza from ISA as well. So we were there. And so in this workshop, because it was very much about a digital repatriation project, we had this conversation, and they told us that they wanted some published materials as well to use in the schools, teaching materials. So we produced this teaching and learning toolkit that had a board game and also a guide for the collections. So that's where Lindsay got into the project again. Want to say something about making the board game?
Yes. So the board game was based on Luciano's game design, game plan that had been figured out from a lot of, meticulously figured out, and then also it took quite a long time with lots of different voices to try and decide really sort of basic things like what were the artifacts going to be that were going to be included, and then what were the constituent parts, so what were the animals, the bird feathers, the plant parts, and what needed to be represented, and then which areas largely should be represented as well. So you have the deep, the terra firma forest, and then the garden, and then the area next to the water, and so all these sort of different regions. And I think and then each plant and animal goes in its correct region, with this idea that Dagoberto, who's one of the Indigenous researchers who's working with us, had talked a lot about the importance of the Maloca, with the ancestral longhouse, and its position in terms of the stars, which direction it should point to. Its mouth should be facing the river, and that became quite crucial to sort of for me in any way in designing the board game. Mm-hmm. So this was it before its information. And Lindsay
drew the illustrations for the guidebook that we wrote of the collections, and we organized the guidebook according to the way the artifacts are used in the Maloca. So we have the ritual artifacts, and then the daily artifacts. So this is the first part of the book, and the second part is more a historical context of the travelers and the collections as well. So we were planning to have a workshop in the Indigenous territory, but then pandemic came, and we had to do, in the meantime, they started having more access to Wi-Fi within the Indigenous territory. So we did a series of online workshops, about 20 of them. And one of the most popular ones was the plant drawing workshops that Lindsay did. We had about 59 people attending that. Would you like to say something about that, Lindsay, quickly?
Yeah, it was wonderful, and people were so enthusiastic about doing it, and it was, and people wanted to talk a lot. That was what was really interesting. It was long, and people wanted more, and I thought that was very exciting. And I also loved the fact that everyone seemed like, normally in terms of sort of teaching art here in the UK, at least, I find that it's very outcome driven. And I am always trying to talk about the importance of the process, and it's the process of drawing. And in fact, it just felt so easy that was almost assumed there, that it was just the process of how looking and talking and drawing was generating new ways of, new information. So
this is the materials that we shared with them online, for example, the drawings of the Maloca by Spruce, and he did a plan as well of the Maloca with all the materials and the dimensions. This is drawings by Wallace, who went to the same region a little bit earlier than Spruce, but he also did, some of his drawings survived. and then they show us, their image of them rebuilding those malacas in the region now. They sent films, which was really amazing with all the different plants that they use, and they sent us also. They sent also the image of them making ceramics, and this was very interesting because Vilma, who took all this documentation, he also filmed his mom collecting the ceramics, and he said that when she was collecting the clay on the riverbank, and he said that while she was collecting, she was telling the kind of the story of the origins of the clay. And he recorded that, and he transcribed and sent to us, and it was amazing, because it was a story that, as Lindsay found out through Steve, what's his name, the anthropologist?
Yeah, Stephen Hugh Jones. Yeah.
Stephen Hugh Jones, who he had collected lots of stories, but by men, and the stories by women are different. So this is something as well that we want to explore more, in the following on project. Really, the stories by women in the region. So just to conclude very quickly, this is we launched the Teaching and Learning Toolkit in the region in October 2021. We weren't there, but Aloisio, the anthropologist, works with us at ISA. He was there, and this on the top, we can see that's the book and the game, the finalized version of the game. We use seeds for the pawns as well. And the book is online. You can get them in our website, and also all the other publications that we did in this the British Academy version of the project. So I just want to conclude with some of the challenges that we face when doing this kind of research. With indigenous communities, with these kinds of biocultural collections. So one thing that is very clear is that you really have to have a kind of long-term commitment. This is a question of getting trust and really being able to work collaboratively with those communities. You have to learn to listen. This is so important because we tend to just try to get things done, but you have to just lay back and listen and learn to do that, which is not very easy because of those different kind of temporalities that we live on. The importance of language, interpretation and translation, this is key. This is something that we had Dagoberto Azevedo, who is a researcher. He's just finished his PhD in the University of the Amazon. So but he is, also a Tucano speaker, so he could translate Tucano into Portuguese, and then I translated from Portuguese to English. So, there's a lot of translation, so we can think about, what's missed as well in this process. And also, the idea of nature. I mean, the indigenous people with whom we are working, they don't have a word for nature. So that you can imagine what, how things get complex when you start dealing with these concepts. We have to have kind of openness and flexibility to enable the co-development of research goals, which is, really not everyone has the same kind of aims and objectives in mind when they're doing that. So it's a kind of very and transdisciplinary project, and you have to understand and reconcile the aims and objectives of different disciplines and ways of understanding the world. Really, it's not just about epistemologies, it's about ontologies, and how to deal with that is not straightforward. Working with multiple institutions, academic and non-academic, with different goals as well, it's something that we need to be very careful, really, to navigate those differences. And also the geographical scales involved in the project, the local, the regional, the national, transnational, the global. And that does relate very much with this next point, to observe ethical norms and protocols related to research with human participants, with genetic heritage and indigenous knowledges. Because, of course, Brazil has a very specific legislation about traditional knowledge, and we have to know about that, but also there are the local kind of norms and protocols that we have to follow. So it's, there's a lot of consultation, negotiation that needs to get on with this kind of project. And also you have to take into consideration these different spatial temporalities and how to incorporate this into the research plan, because this is something that you have to think very early on. And this is something that's a bit problematic, thinking about funding, because of course, the funding institutions, they want outcomes, they want, timelines, and they want, the milestones. And in this kind of project, things work very differently, in the field and in, the kind of in London and in some Gabriel Cachoeira, there are completely different kind of ideas of time. And this, the field work you're going to do, it would take 3 days, just to get there by boat to the indigenous communities in the indigenous territory. So, these kind of things, really you have to think a lot beforehand. So I think I'll leave it there now so you can ask your questions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lindsay and Luciano, for sharing that presentation. It was so fascinating. And again, I have many, many questions, but I will leave it to our lovely audience. So if anyone has any questions, again, please feel free to virtually raise your hand or to write something into the chat. We've just had a comment from Maura Flannery, who's said that she read the article that Luciano and Lindsay wrote in the Ethnobotanical Assembly, but especially enjoyed the presentation. That's very nice to hear.
Yeah, you can have the link of that in the website, the project website. We have a link to that.
Yeah, would you also be able to, we can certainly send out the link to the project if you'd like us to, but perhaps we could put it in the chat as well in case anyone wants to. I certainly want to have a look. We've got a question from Iris. Iris, please go ahead.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much. This was really fascinating. I had one question to Lindsay and perhaps also to Luciana. I was very intrigued by how you used, I think that you talked about the pigments that you then used on that large scale image. And I was wondering, so did you collect all these plants in the field, or where did you get them from? And then the other thing, I love the toolkit, and I'm just working at the moment with a Chevening fellow from Mexico, from the Nahuatl community there, who is doing instantaneous books from our collections. So I saw that you had the real items, you really brought them out to the community, right? It was not online. That was the other question, not sure to whom.
Yeah, they ask for it. They ask for it because they have lots of schools in the region that are trying to recover, their heritage, including they produce books in their language as well. So, they really are very interested in anything that we can, give back to them about this. So that's why we had this idea to do the game, because then you can involve really the school children, more intensely. But yeah, I'll stop there. Lindsay didn't say.
So for all the materials, I guess it's a lot of it is just a kind of patient waiting for when I can do work. It's sort of in the field and bring back. A lot of things are not able to transport. For that particular pigment, though, it's one of the more common. Is kind of commercially used. It's still in the UK a bit, so you can all. I did try. I had a sapling of it also growing. eBay, wonderful resource. So yeah, just sort of some kind of bringing small things and others. Yeah, just sort of slowly accumulating where possible.
Thank you. Yeah, really inspiring as well. There's reconnecting with the communities. I think that's very important. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. And I can see Felix Driver has just very kindly shared the link to the article that Maura mentioned earlier in the chat if anyone would like to have a look. before we move on, I'm just going to take the liberty to ask one very quick question to you both. You reflected a lot on the material kind of side of your process and the materiality of the project as a whole. And I just wondered if you could maybe share one very small piece of advice for any scholars, especially early career or PhD scholars that might be in the audience today, that perhaps have never worked with specimens or have never really worked with material culture. Where do you begin, or how do you begin, or how did you begin in your own process?
Well, I think I agree with what Lesley said at the in the end of her talk. Talk to the curators, talk to, I, at least, of course, Lindsay can speak for herself, but, in my case, I learned a lot talking to Mark Nesbitt, who is curator of, economic botany, with William Millikan, who, ethnobotanist, who knows, a lot about the plants from the Amazon. So, it's that knowledge that people who work in the institutions have, and I just recently found out that they have the fungi as well. The most beautiful kind of specimens that spruce collected, and that is the fungarium in Kew that I didn't even know that existed, despite working there since 2015. So these things they take time, but the more you talk to the people who work in these places, really, the archivists, the more you find out, and the more you learn how to handle as well those, and to pay attention as well, because, for example, these herbarium specimens, at first you look at them and say, okay, this dead plant, doesn't mean anything, and then as you start digging into, and this is something that we do in this article, really, you start looking that there's a kind of, first of all, this kind of labels that, you can find, not always, but sometimes if you have botanists like spruce, you find those very detailed labels. But then there's, all the taxonomy that changes, as well. So, there's a kind of history of taxonomy on the herbarium sheets. And then you have also the history of the herbarium sheet itself, because it travels, So you have the stamps from the different institutions. You went to the New York Botanic Garden, you went there. So, there's so much history in one piece of paper. And, in the herbarium, you have, the same specimen, the first one collected and then the last one on the top. So you have also this kind of history there, it's just fantastic. But, it doesn't come immediately. You really have to start learning to look at this as well.
And I have to sort of say it because drawing is central to my sort of practice and study, but I do think really drawing from as well has such a role, not just for artists, for other researchers, I think as well, because the questions that generate, through drawing and that really intense, close looking, and it, you can connect with the original makers in a way that I think that is very exciting as well. And these decisions that are made and things that are woven, or you see handprints in the ceramics. And I think that, trust is that relationship between your head and your brain, your eyes, your hands, sort of trust the way you trust yourself and your own questions that you develop, because they are also, I think, relevant as much as any things that have gone before.
Brilliant. Thank you both so much. That was really fantastic insight into everything you've been doing. So we'll give you all a virtual clap quickly before moving on to, I can see some claps coming through, wonderful. Before we move on to our final presenter for today, who is Kristen Hansen, who's joining us very kindly from the US this afternoon for us, morning in the US. But Kristen is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Dumbarton Oaks, working as part of the Plant Humanities Initiative. And I was very lucky to take part in the Plant Humanities Initiative's summer program last year, which is how I came to know about this. And although this isn't a Latin America specific project, it has a lot of material that does certainly relate to Latin American studies and environmental humanities more generally. So Kristen's going to tell us a bit about the initiative and the work that they've been doing there. So please take it away, Kristen, if you can share your screen whenever you're ready. Hopefully it's still working. And fantastic. Okay. Great. Is that working on your end, Kristen?
Yeah. So
yeah,
it's all set up.
Okay.
So thank you so much for your invitation to participate in this workshop. It's been wonderful, and I've learned so much from the presenters already. So again, my name is Kristen Hansen, and I currently serve as the digital managing editor for the Plant Humanities Initiative at Dumbarton Oaks. And prior to that, I held an academic year fellowship in plant humanities there. I'm trained as an art historian, and my specialization is in French visual culture and botanical art of the global 19th century. So my presentation today will introduce the plant humanities at Dumbarton Oaks. Okay, apologies for that. If you're not familiar with our organization, Dumbarton Oaks is a Harvard University Research Institute, library, museum, and garden located in Washington, D.C. The Institute hosts a vibrant community of fellows and interns, as well as engaging meetings and compelling exhibitions. We host approximately 50 researchers on site per year, and our museum and garden are public-facing. Dumbarton Oaks was created by Mildred and Robert Woods Bliss, who are collectors and patrons of art and scholarship in the humanities. And this photograph shows a view looking toward the main house that has today become part of a home for the humanities. So Mildred Barnes Bliss was also a patron of horticulture, and she worked closely with renowned landscape designer Beatrix Ferrand to transform the land surrounding the main house into terrace gardens and vistas. So here's a view of the North Terrace as seen from the back of the main residence. And this Friday, we'll celebrate the 100th anniversary of Ferrand's design of the Dumbarton Oaks landscape. Dumbarton Oaks Library and Collection support research and learning internationally in 3 subject areas: Byzantine, Pre-Columbian, and garden and landscape studies. While the traditional focus of garden and landscape studies has been the human-designed landscape, Dumbarton Oaks has, over the past decade, developed programs that center plants and humanistic inquiry in keeping with current interests in the environmental humanities, plant studies, and foodways and food studies. This new direction has drawn on and promoted greater access to the rich holdings of the Dumbarton Oaks Rare Book Collection, which includes herbals, horticultural treatises, and albums of botanical illustrations. These rare and unique materials support research and teaching in the areas of botanical publication and illustration, botanical gardens and plant collecting, and garden and landscape history. So we've been actively digitizing these materials and making them available through Harvard University's Hollis catalog. And owing to a substantial increase in the use of these rare materials, we're planning a reconfiguration of the rare book reading room, seen here, to accommodate more researchers. The reading room was built in the 1960s, though its design takes inspiration from 18th century libraries. The Plant Humanities Initiative was established in 2018 and is now in its 4th year. The goal of the initiative is to highlight the significance of plants to human cultures and sharpen our awareness of their importance to help address pressing human and environmental challenges in the Anthropocene. While the term plant humanities is new, the area of inquiry it stands for is not. Rather, the plant humanities embraces aspects of the environmental humanities, as well as plant science, history, art history, the history of science, literature, and race, gender, and Indigenous studies. This photograph documents one of the activities of the Plant Humanities Initiative, an exhibition of work by the artist, explorer, and environmentalist Margaret Mee. Margaret Mee Portraits of Plants presented 20 paintings of Amazonian flora by Mee in the Dumbarton Oaks Rare Book Collection. The works, acquired by Dumbarton Oaks founder Mildred Bliss in 1966 and 1967, and dating to Mee's first 3 exhibitions in the Amazon, had never been displayed together until this exhibition. The roots of the Plant Humanities Initiative lie in research and programs at Dumbarton Oaks that were developed to emphasize the importance of humanistic modes of interpretation in scholarly investigation of plants and their entanglement with humans. More specifically, Dumbarton Oaks hosted a 2013 symposium, The Botany of Empire in the Long 18th Century, which highlighted the Institute's rare book collection and brought plants center stage. The two-day symposium served as the impetus for an edited volume, Botany of Empire, that in turn sparked a conversation between Dumbarton Oaks and JSTOR about leveraging their respective strengths to create new resources for accessing special collections. Of greatest interest to JSTOR was building pathways for humanists to access its global plants database with more than 3 million high-resolution images of herbarium specimens and related materials. The repository is the fruit of decades of investment by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in digitizing the world's herbaria. In 2018, Dumbarton Oaks and JSTOR Labs submitted sister applications to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and were each awarded 3-year grants to develop a digital platform and related scholarly programming to advance the emerging field of plant humanities. This partnership brings together an interdisciplinary team of researchers, curators, librarians, web designers, and software developers. And growing out of this collaboration, the Plant Humanities Lab website and Juncture are 2 long-lasting products that showcase how special collections can be used in interdisciplinary research and provide tools for students and faculty to create their own research projects. The lab was launched in beta form in March 2021. And we also plan a capstone conference at Dumbarton Oaks in September 2022. The conference, which will serve as a vehicle for disseminating knowledge and fostering scholarly community, will have a lasting impact on the development of plant humanities curricula in tandem with the Plant Humanities Lab and Juncture. The lab is an innovative digital space that supports the interdisciplinary study of plants and provides pathways to accessing digitized special collections. The centerpiece of the lab are the plant narratives, which were researched and created by plant humanists at various career stages. Equally significant, the lab has a plant-oriented search and resource discovery interface powered by linked open data that gives access to a wealth of data and digitized materials. Phase 1 of the lab supports the discovery of plant-focused content available in Wikidata, alongside primary and secondary sources from the Biodiversity Heritage Library, JSTOR Global Plants, JSTOR, and ArtStore. So this animation shows the result of running a search for the plant Theobroma cacao, commonly known as cacao tree. And the tabs on the left side link to taxonomic information about the plant, and those on the right side bring up herbarium specimens from global plants and other resources. The lab's search and resource discovery interface is powered by linked open data. So the search is retrieving any items that are connected with the Wikidata entity for the plant species Theobroma cacao. And we envision this component of the lab as a means for introducing teachers and students to new resources that they may be unaware of or unsure how to integrate into their teaching and research. So note that right now the search portal is being updated, so the page is not loading correctly. So now that I've provided a little bit of information about the background of the project, I thought that I would demonstrate some of the interactive features of the different narratives that are currently live on the lab. One way that you can navigate to the lab is by going to the homepage for the Plant Humanities Initiative. I can drop this in the chat at the end of my presentation. This might be the page that you would want to bookmark because it also provides information about the Plant Humanities Conference that'll be happening in September. And it also contains information about funded programs for researchers, students, and faculty. And I'll tell you a little bit about some of those in a moment. So this is the Plant Humanities Lab homepage. At the top, you'll see that there's a search box, and this search box will open onto the Plant Humanities search portal that I just demonstrated a moment ago. But what I want to focus on with you today are sharing some of the visual narratives that are really the centerpiece of the lab. So at the top, we have a series of 6 featured plant narratives about cacao, sunflower, heliconia, peony, cinnamon, and bananas. And then after that, we feature all of the plant narratives contained in the lab in alphabetical order. Most narratives tell the story of a single plant at the genus or species level. Some, however, focus on a group of plants associated with a particular common name. And while we initially focused on telling the stories of lesser known plants, such as heliconia, faculty and other stakeholders have since requested more coverage of well-known plants told from the perspectives of agriculture, foodways, indigenous knowledge, colonialism, and environmental history. So I'm currently managing the editing and publishing process of several new narratives, including black-eyed pea, ayahuasca, and Japanese cypress. And then looking forward, we have summer interns, a postgraduate fellow, and summer school students who will be working on a new batch of plants that will likely include chili pepper, poplar, eggplant, tulip tree, rhubarb, and opium poppy. And we're always looking for suggestions about what plants would make for good candidates for adding new narratives to the lab. And we also welcome contributions. So if you have an interest in contributing a narrative or a suggestion about what we might add that could enrich your teaching, please feel free to reach out and share those with me. In terms of function, we envision the narratives, all of which go through a peer review process, being used as an alternative to a traditional textbook. The narratives also model how to integrate primary sources such as herbarium specimens and botanical images into cultural studies of plants. And right now we're thinking about another sort of branch of the lab that would host a different sort of narrative. Those would be how-to essays that would encourage students from diverse disciplinary backgrounds to work with primary sources related to plants. So some topics that we're entertaining are what's in a botanical name, fundamentals of plant taxonomy, how to read an herbarium specimen, how to read a botanical illustration, how to read flowers in art, how to visualize botanical networks, and how to engage with an economic botany collection, which is particularly relevant to the presentation that we just saw. So again, if you have thoughts about how we might create a how-to essay that would help your students incorporate primary source material into assignments, we welcome your suggestions for those. So this narrative was co-authored by Yota Betsaki, who is the executive director of Dumbarton Oaks and the principal investigator of the Plant Humanities Initiative, along with John Kress, who is a botanist and the vice president for science at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. And it brings together herbarium specimens, botanical illustrations, plant portraits, and scientific models to tell the narrative of heliconia from the perspectives of art and science. And the key episode in the narrative recounts how Kress was paging through a book reproducing illustrations of heliconia made by the botanical artist Margaret Mee. And upon seeing one of the illustrations, Kress realized that Mee had depicted what he then believed was a new species. So Kress ultimately retraced Mee's journey to Venezuela, where he found the plant, identified it as a new variety, and named it after Mee. So now that you know one sort of strand of this narrative, I'll show you some of the essay's interactive features that are supported by the Juncture software. So you'll notice as you scroll down that essays are divided into 2 parts. The pane at the left contains text, and then the pane at the right will display different types of visualizations. In this case, it's an image visualization, but as you'll see, as I scroll through, other types of visualizations show maps or YouTube videos or timelines or interactive images with annotations. So any text that appears with an underline beneath it, when the reader hovers over that text with a mouse, that opens up a pop-up window that is connected to a Wikidata entity. And that displays information that's hosted in the Wikidata knowledge base and that you might encounter if you visited a Wikipedia page or a Wikimedia page. So this use of linked open data is a hallmark of Juncture and can be customized by the author or authors of a narrative. So another type of dynamic interaction that's supported by Juncture is this ability to click on text within a visual narrative that interacts dynamically with the visualization. In this case, it's a high resolution of a botanical illustration by Margaret Mee, and it zooms in on different features of the plant. So the image viewer at right contains high resolution images, or rather links to them, one of which shows a botanical illustration by Margaret Mee housed at Dumbarton Oaks. And the other two images are herbarium specimens of heliconia that were collected by Kress and are now housed at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. The gallery invites comparing how these media preserve, communicate, and disseminate information about plants. And most images used in the lab are high resolution and support this kind of zooming in and zooming out and panning. And then they all also include metadata or descriptive information supplied in most cases by the holding institutions of the objects or images. And we generally try and find images and other content that are available public domain or with a Creative Commons license. In some cases, we do license images when that's needed. And in more sort of technical terms, the lab visualization tool is compatible with IIIF standards. So that means that in addition to linking to JPEGs, TIFFs, and other image files, we can also link to IIIF images and manifest files. So that allows us to pull the metadata associated with an image indirectly to the lab. So another type of interactive that the Juncture software supports are external links. And those are indicated by blue text with an underline. And I wanted to take an opportunity to show you this one because many of the resources that we draw on for the visual narratives are housed in the Biodiversity Heritage Library collection. And if that's something that you haven't used or aren't familiar with, it's a really wonderful resource. It's the world's largest open access digital library for biodiversity, literature, and archives. And it's great for finding digitized rare books. You can often download a whole book and you can run a full text search in a book. You can also often highlight pages and email them to yourself as a PDF. So in this case, we've used the stable external link to create a link in our essay. And I wanted to show you this, that this is supports a full text search, and then also comes with metadata. And what's nice about the BHL resources is that they often provide a copyright or end use statement. So you know exactly what materials are in public domain and how you can reuse them for your own research and teaching. So additionally, this is Curtis's Botanical magazine. You'll see that many of the images are really high res and you can zoom in and out on them. And for our purposes in the lab, we can always zoom in and open an image in a new tab and then use that link to link that to a visual essay. So there's several additional visualizations that I wanted to show you within heliconia. This is an image of me in the field making a sketch after plants. And then this is a photograph of Kress and his team after they've recovered a plant that he later identifies as a new variety and names after me. See. And this is one of the visualization tools that's heavily used as a sort of annotation tool, which allows authors to create a sort of guided tour through an image by zooming and panning and then adding annotations to details, which is particularly useful if you want to zoom in on different parts of the plant and sort of invite the sort of close looking that presenters were just speaking about. So through this collaboration with Kress, he supplied information that he'd been gathering through his research on the interactions between heliconia and hummingbirds, and then insects as well. We used that data to create a network model, which supports dynamic interactions that readers can click on these different nodes to parse or visually articulate the different ways that organisms interact with heliconia and the purposes for which they do so, whether that's for shelter, for food, or for pollination. And another type of visualization that you'll see used quite often are maps. This type of map has an overlay of geospatial data that Kress also supplied to us to show where two different types of species of heliconia had been collected over the last 200 years. And this is data that was gathered from herbarium specimens and that Kress supplied to us. So this is the key for that layer of information that's been mapped. The top is Heliconia aurea, which indicates that the mapping of the magenta dots corresponds to collection points for that plant, and the green dots correspond to Heliconia baha'i. And the authors have created these interactive links to zoom in on parts of the map to emphasize the disparity between how many of these different types of plants had been collected and from where. And Kress wanted to emphasize that this kind of data is being mobilized by scientists to determine which species are most vulnerable and at greatest risk of extinction. I can show you some features of another essay, Maize, which was authored by one of our postgraduate fellows, Julia Fine. And the essay grows out of a collaboration between the Plant Humanities team and Pre-Columbian Studies. And it's based on a lecture that Frauke Zaxa, who's the director of Pre-Columbian Studies, gave to the Plant Humanities team in the fall. And the essay enriches our selection of plant narratives related to agriculture, foodways, and indigenous knowledge. And it opens up with a map and an account of the 2014 protest in Guatemala, when roughly 120,000 protesters took to the streets in opposition to the Monsanto law. And as this map shows, protesters blocked traffic on the Pan American Highway, and the law sought to regulate the use of specific maize seeds engineered by Monsanto. And in doing so, the law made farmers increasingly dependent on big agribusiness and US corporations. So taking this episode as its point of departure, the essay explores the significance of maize in Mesoamerican societies, cosmologies, and cultures. It brings together an array of primary sources such as a Mayan vessel, Aztec and Spanish codices, herbarium specimens, illustrations, and photographs of the 2014 protest. And I wanted to use this essay as an opportunity to show you just a few more visualizations. One of those is another map. So narratives often reconstruct the movement of plants, trends regionally and globally, and many authors use maps to visualize plant mobility and trade routes, migration patterns, and or networks of knowledge exchange. So this is a good example of that. And then in many cases, authors incorporate a interactive timeline into their narrative that allows them to delve deeper into topics which would otherwise sort of disrupt the narrative. And in this case, the author has used a Night Labs timeline, which was developed by Northwestern University to provide an overview of the beginnings of Spanish colonization in the Americas. And then the last type of visualization I wanted to highlight today is this one, which is a plant specimen visual tool, and it's pulling plant specimens from JSTOR Global Plants. And what's nice about these is that they support opening a full screen image of the specimen and sort of zooming in and out on that specimen, and also support a sequential gallery of different specimens. So in the time remaining, I just wanted to point out two things. One of which is that the lab is the flagship use of Juncture, which is a new tool and open source framework co-developed by Dumbarton Oaks and JSTOR Labs. And that's a free tool that is available to anyone that they can use to create a multimedia websites and visual narratives. And as you've seen, Juncture is being used in our case to create digital stories for publishing on the web. And Juncture is housed on GitHub, which is a storage space for software and related files for creating and publishing a website. So this is our Juncture page. And I would invite you to visit our Plant Humanities Initiative homepage, where you can learn more about opportunities for scholars and for students. We have a virtual summer residency program for college level instructors. And then we also have a humanities summer school program for advanced undergraduate students and graduate students. And they work in teams to create some of the plant narratives that have been published to the lab, and including Elizabeth's featuring Peanut. So I'll just close by providing the links to the resources that I shared with you today, and the contact information for Yota, who's again the executive director of Dumbarton Oaks and who's the principal investigator for the Plant Humanities Initiative there. And then the contact information for Anatol Chaikin, who's the curator of Rare Books and is also a co-investigator for the Plant Humanities Initiative. And I include my email address, especially if you have interest in incorporating the lab into your classroom teaching, or if you want to contribute a plant narrative, please reach out to me. I'd be happy to hear about your interest.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Kristen. It's been amazing again to hear about a project that I really, really enjoyed the very small opportunity to collaborate on. Everyone read the Peanut narrative, it's great. But we've got a couple of minutes now for some questions. So if anyone has any questions, please again, raise a virtual hand or feel free to write something in the chat as well. Iris.
Okay, I'll take the opportunity. Thank you, Kristen. That's really interesting information and great tools. I was wondering if there are initiatives to reach out to Indigenous communities as well, who have knowledge of these plants, and to integrate their knowledge in any way into this resource website?
That's a wonderful question. And I think that's something that we realize is a shortcoming in the perspectives that are currently reflected in some of the plant narratives. Moving forward, we'd like to partner with some institutions in the area who are, one of which hosts an experimental farm, and sort of bring practitioners and invite them to contribute knowledge about plants. But I think that that's an area that we're aware is underrepresented in the perspectives that are currently shared in the narratives.
Thank you.
Thanks both. And just in case anyone hasn't seen, Kristen has just put links to the Plant Humanities Lab and the initiative into the chat. And those are also on the event page for this event as well, in case any of you would like to have a look. And it's really worth spending some time exploring some of the resources on there, because they're really fantastic and very sort of captivating, I think, especially in terms of the appeal they might have in classrooms for any of you who are teaching in the audience. Any other questions or thoughts or kind of comments on anything from that final presentation? Maya has just written in the chat that she wishes to thank everyone for their presentations and the work being done to make information and resources more accessible. Christina has asked when the details will go live about the conference, Kristen, that's in September.
We're in the planning stages and just finalizing the panels and the presenters. So I'm not sure when the final schedule will go live, but the conference is going to be held both in person and then over video. So everybody will be able to attend over streaming.
Great. I think there was some really, Felix has just put a comment. Yeah, Felix, Caroline Cornish and Martinez recently wrote a report to the HRC on plant humanities as a new field with Dumbarton Oaks. And there's a link, the link to the Ethnobotanical Assembly that was posted earlier has some more information about that. So everyone keep an eye out for the AHRC report that hopefully will be coming very soon. Fantastic, thank you so much for sharing that, Felix. Any other final comments or thoughts before we wrap things up? We're running actually on time, which is fantastic. I guess I might finish us off by asking a similar question, Kristen, to what I asked Lindsay and Luciano earlier, which is perhaps what's really fantastic, I think, about the Dumbarton Oaks work is obviously the digital humanities side of what you're doing in terms of making resources related to plant humanities available much more broadly than perhaps they would be normally, and also connecting different resources, which is something that I felt was particularly great about when I was doing the summer program, is that there were databases and websites and things that I'd never heard of that I was able to access through some of the kind of search functionalities that we were being introduced to. So perhaps if someone's interested in reaching into digital humanities that has an interest in environmental history or plant humanities or any of those fields more broadly, where would you start, or how would you begin? Which is a big question, I appreciate. But any tips or tricks?
No, I'm really happy to hear that you say that, and that's what you took from your experience with plant humanities, because the sort of driving force for the project was creating a resource that would provide pathways to digitize primary sources and really introduce people to the wealth of collections that are already digitized that they might not yet be aware of. So one thing that you might do when just perusing the essays is take a look at what sources we're drawing the materials from, because we're really making every effort to connect to a public domain and Creative Commons licensed works that anybody can use, whether that's for their artistic practice or for their research or teaching. So that's one way where you might sort of be introduced to the types of collections that are out there. And then also, I would recommend checking out Biodiversity Heritage Library, because that's a sort of feeder for digitized collections around the world.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Well, we have hit our final time, which is great. Yeah, Felix said totally agree about Biodiversity Heritage Library. It is really such a great resource, and it connects so many different resources as well in such brilliant ways, which make them much more findable, which is always always the aim. Little known arguments, humanity skills. Yeah, it's true, I think, but hopefully that's changing, and that's hopefully in the UK, and that's hopefully what we were trying to achieve by hosting this event today. It was meant to be a very kind of preliminary, introductory session that hopefully you might have learnt about a new resource or a new technique or a new method that perhaps you hadn't considered using in your work before. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. Thank you especially to our presenters. Sadly, they're not all still with us, but it's been really, really fantastic to hear from you all. And I think the convergences between the presentations were quite striking, actually. So I hope you all learned something from it as well. I should also say thank you to Kathy Collins from the IMLR for facilitating this event, and also to Ainhoa Montoya, who's in the audience as well, I believe, who's been instrumental in helping us to make this event happen. And I don't know if Mark Nesbitt is still here, but I did see Mark in the audience earlier on, and Mark also had a hand in helping this come together. So I'm really, really grateful to him for suggesting Luciano and Lindsay as fantastic presenters for this workshop. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. It's been a pleasure to hear about all of your projects this afternoon. And as I mentioned earlier, this event has been recorded, so it should be available through the School of Advanced Studies YouTube page at a later date if you want to have a look at anything that was mentioned. And hopefully you've all noted down some of those links, but we can certainly keep hold of those, and please get in touch with us if you missed something that you'd like to get hold of. Thank you again, everyone, and have a good afternoon.